All right, welcome everyone today to our session, Brooklyn College, Remote Learning and Oral History in the Time of COVID. I'm Zach Ellis, the founder and CEO of TheirStory. I had the absolute pleasure of auditing Professor Phil Napoli's oral history course this past semester. So I got to learn a lot, not just about how TheirStory might be of service to oral historians and to students and to educators, but also actually getting to learn as I was going about oral history as well from an amazing oral historian and Professor Napoli. So today we're going to talk about a few things, mainly about the experience that Malkah and Xander and Professor Napoli had this past semester. In a moment, I'll have them each introduce themselves, but a couple things in terms of the recording. We'll be making this accessible on TheirStory's Aviary account, so we'll make it searchable. We'll have the transcript and an index to make this all much more accessible and viewable, both for anyone who wants to review things today or folks that couldn't make the session. We'll also be preserving the recording on TheirStory's permanent.org archive for preservation. One thing that I'm going to mention kind of in framing today's conversation as well is through the lens of actually a book that has changed my life, Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces. I'd like to think of our conversation today less of just a presentation, but thinking about us maybe as the interviewers with 1,000 or maybe 48 faces as the number of participants that we have here. Please feel free, while I'm prepared to ask questions for the entirety of our time and kind of interview our cast here. I really encourage and invite you all to chime in at any moment and just unmute yourself and follow your curiosity and ask questions. And let's view this together as actually an oral history, if you will, of the lived experience of Professor Napoli, of Malkah, of Xander this past semester, and let's create kind of an oral history together today. So a couple things in terms of housekeeping. If you aren't speaking, however, please do mute yourself just so we don't have feedback. Again, encourage you to be an active participant in today's call. If you have a question, if something pops up, let's make sure that this is something that is a creation of all of us. But of course, I'll continue to guide the conversation if we have the need. And one thing I would like to do before we even have go to introductions and kind of kick things off is to really think about you all and thinking about that idea of making this participatory. I'd like to take maybe just a minute if anyone wants to unmute themselves and say something that they came to this session wanting to learn in particular, or any open questions that they had, so that as Malkah, Xander, as Professor Napoli are kind of talking about their experience, they can make sure to keep in mind things that you wanted to take away, and we can make sure that this is as productive as possible. I know it will be anyways, but I like to do this at the beginning. So feel free, if you want, to unmute yourself. I'll pause just to see if we have anyone that wants to share something that they in particular were interested to learn today.
I guess I can go.
Sure.
My name's Danny, and I am a third-year PhD student at Michigan State in the history department. And so right now I'm comping, but soon, starting this summer, I'm planning on doing an oral history of restaurant workers in Michigan. And so I'm really here to just learn about your experience and the tools also that you used. I haven't heard of any of them, so I'm just interested in learning anything that you have to offer. It all sounds really interesting.
Fantastic. Thank you, Danny. Welcome. Anyone else have something that they wanted to learn in particular?
Hi there.
Hi, Bridget.
Hi, I'm a PhD candidate in creative writing at Southampton University in the south of England, but I'm also studying at Cambridge in a distance learning course on teaching creative writing, and I'm particularly interested in teaching oral history, writing personal and oral histories. So I'm hoping to get actually teaching tips as well as.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bridget. Tammy, I saw you raise your hand. Did you want to share something or just testing out the features?
Hey, yeah, sorry. I was actually just testing that, but I love shortcuts, so I appreciate learning that. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm also a PhD candidate, actually in cultural anthropology at UK, and Zach, you and I met previously doing a TheirStory demo. So I was actually teaching an ethnographic methods course this spring when everything broke. Um, so I'm always interested in learning from other people's experience, and especially since you and I talked about the development of TheirStory in, a formal educational learning environment post-pandemic, when people are really struggling on how do we do field work and how do we continue to do it well and ethically and robustly in a way where rich storytelling still occurs and deep listening still occurs. So thanks for organizing this webinar.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tammy. Good to see you again. And I think ethics is definitely a part that we'll touch on today as well. Any others before we kick off the conversation and have our team here introduce themselves?
Hi, this is Erica Walsh. I'm from the Moore Free Library in Newfane, Vermont. We are a recipient of the IMLS Accelerating Promising Practices grant. We're a small rural library, and we're doing an oral history project, which is underway. We had originally intended to do most of it in person, but now we're doing some of it remotely. And we considered but chose not to get TheirStory. However, I'm quite interested in any whatever you all have to say about doing remote interviews, but particularly in transcribing interviews, and any best practices or software or ideas that you have for transcription.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I think we'll talk about both the tech side, but even a lot about lessons learned around remote interviewing, agnostic of tech, and I think Malkah, Xander, Professor Napoli can touch on the transcription piece as well, which is something that they used through TheirStory for this section. Fantastic. Well, thank you. And again, please feel free to ask questions as we go, chime in. If there's anything you want to learn, feel free to make sure you come away learning it. Ask away. So off we go. So let's start maybe with some introductions. Malkah, do you want to introduce yourself and then pass it off to Xander? And then Professor Napoli will have you kind of introduce yourself and kick off how things started and how we met and how really the course started to take shape for you. So go for it, Malkah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Malkah. I'm a recent Brooklyn College graduate, and I will be going into the Brooklyn College graduate program coming in February. And so I have been interested. I've also been a teacher for 5 years in a couple different private schools. And so doing this whole project that I did, as Professor Napoli, I'm sure we'll talk about, opened me to a world that I could introduce my history students to. And I am excited to interact with all of you and hear your various questions.
Great. Thank you, Malkah. Xander.
Hi, everybody. I'm Xander Raff. I'm currently an undergraduate student at Brooklyn College in my junior year. I am by way of Hunter College and by way of the United States Army. So I'm currently on the GI Bill and making the best use of that, learning history at Brooklyn College. And yeah, I had a great time doing everything with Professor Napoli and Malkah and Zach, and I'm excited to speak with you all about it and hear what you guys want to learn and how I can impart some wisdom, hopefully, from this experience.
Thank you, Xander. And Professor Napoli, if you want to talk a little bit about yourself, the work you do, and maybe segue that into how this all came to be, and how you kind of set expectations for what you thought might be possible for the course, and how we met. Go for it.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. Welcome. My thanks to Zach and Xander and Malkah for agreeing to do this and including our experiences. I am Philip Napoli. I am an associate professor of history and chairman of the department at Brooklyn College. I've been an oral historian for about 20 years. It's incredibly cool for me to be on this side and see so many familiar names in the audience. Dr. Shopes and Professor Frisch and others whose work I have learned from for many years. I have done most of my work around US military veterans, and I've been teaching a version of this course since 2001. That was an interesting year to start teaching oral history at Brooklyn College. So to start, what I want, everybody knows what happened in March, and it shook everybody up, and we all had to make this fast transition to online learning. And I wasn't teaching in the spring. I had a semester off. And so I was watching my colleagues struggle with this sudden transformation of pedagogy. And I knew that I'd be teaching oral history in the fall, and I began to grope for tools that would allow me to do the kind of work I needed to do, anticipating that we were all going to be online in the fall. And so I participated in a range of these webinars. There were a whole series of them done by Baylor, and Columbia had a number of them. And I went and I listened around. And on one, perhaps, Zach, it was the Baylor one, right?
It was the Baylor, yeah.
Yeah, that Zach posted something in a chat saying, you know, I've got this tool that might actually help people do online learning.
Or Doug Boyd posted it.
Very good. And I snagged that thing out of the chat and put it in my little text box and tried to follow up. And of course I tried to hack his system and couldn't do it, which is good. And then ended up writing saying, you know, I'd like to know more. And I guess we got onto the telephone, or maybe it was a phone yes. First and then Zoom, to start a conversation. We began to talk. I guess it was probably April.
It was.
Maybe it was May of the year. And I learned about what the program could do. Over the course of the summer, we came to an arrangement by which my class would use the product. I became convinced that this was a useful tool for a whole range of reasons, which I can explain. And then I began to build it into the syllabus. The great privilege was having Zach actually join the class. That meant a lot, I think, to me, and my estimation is to the students as well. Let's see, what else? The goals and expectations for the students. I wanted students to record 7 hours of oral history, remotely or on the telephone, whichever tool they wanted to use, which is quite a lot of oral history recording. I did it deliberately. It's a 4-credit class, so it's got elevated expectations by comparison to traditional history electives. But I also think of interviewing as a muscle that needs to be exercised in order to get strong. I will tell you that 7 hours proved to be an aspirational goal rather than one that was always met. That's an interesting truth about this semester. It was a hard term for my students. Malkah and Xander are exceptional, but many of my students work full time. And they had trouble meeting those goals, and that's okay. We can make adjustments. The structure of the class, well, the goal was to have a kind of conversational class in which I would introduce some particular topic. I have, by the way, dropped the syllabus into the chat. If you scroll up, you can find it, and it's available as a link, as a Google Doc. We would have students recording regularly. I guess the first thing we did was I modeled an interview with a friend of mine, a professional dancer, named Dolores Abelson, and then sort of the students took off and began to develop their own project. Xander and Malkah will talk about theirs.
What concerns, how did you think this semester might be different from all other semesters? And what concerns did you have about doing an oral history program when you couldn't be meeting in person?
Well, the very first thing is that Zoom has built-in limitations, right? Unless you have some kind of corporate or educational account, and we didn't at the beginning of the semester, they have 40-minute limits. And that would be very, very difficult for an oral history program to manage. So I needed something that would allow my students to record at length if we're going to do in-depth work. And I also needed a tool that was easy to use. I actually find Zoom a little bit complicated. And I do know that it is complicated for, let's say, folks who are not technologically savvy. My mom, as one example, who's 90 years old, really can't manage it. By contrast, Zoom is one click, and TheirStory is one click and you're in. So I was persuaded that this would work as a tool for interviewing people at all technological capacities. It also works on the phone and more. So those kinds of things were very attractive to me. I think that's enough for me at the moment. Let's turn it over to Xander and Malkah.
Sounds good. So Xander, Malkah, maybe if you would talk a little bit about how you came to the course and what expectations you had coming in and what, if any, interviewing experience you had when you first arrived at the course.
All right, I'll go first. So for me, this was really my first full semester at Brooklyn College. I came back after 3 years off raising my son last semester and had to drop my classes pretty abruptly because of COVID and a moving arrangement simultaneously. But so I knew that I wanted to take something that would be really engaging. I knew Professor Napoli had worked with veterans, and myself being one, was extremely intrigued at how he applies history to the case of listening to veterans, but also specifically understanding oral history. I admittedly was very poorly versed on the scope of oral history as its own entity and the what it provided to history as a whole. And so I really wanted to get that out of the course, and I'm happy to say I did. But yeah, so my expectations were just really, coming in to learn something that I didn't have a strong grasp about, even though I have always loved history and the majority of my classwork has been history. Just understanding what oral history was separately was not something I knew. And so that was what I came for. And I'm glad to say Professor Napoli taught me.
Fantastic. And Malkah, what about you? Kind of your experience coming in, expectations, go for that. And then I'm going to ask you another follow-up question. I already know, but go for it, Malkah.
So I came to this class partially because, I was in my last semester, so I did need to take the class, but I had worked previously with Professor Napoli, and so I did want to work with him again, and I teach. So and at the same time as I teach, I'm also an introvert and don't excessively spend a lot of time talking to people. So I thought that the intersectionality of those two things would be rather interesting. And I do enjoy talking to people on the level of wanting to know about them and their lives. And so that aspect of oral history appealed to me. And so I was invested in the topic in all of those various ways.
And what concerns, if any, did you have coming in and thinking about as an introvert, play into any concerns? Or what? Tell me about how you were thinking, or any fears or anxieties, and how that kind of played out.
So as I mentioned, I can come off as a little awkward in person, but when you interact with people online, which is how I figured that we would do a lot of our interviews, I think you behave in a different way, and almost as if you're putting on a persona that can be very close to who you really are, but because there's a barrier between you and the other person, you're in your comfort space and so are they. It allows for a more freedom of discussion, and it because of that comfort, it allows people to share things with you that they may not have shared if in an in-person interview where they're coming into your space or you're coming into their space. And so that, like, when I did my first couple interviews and I kind of realized that, I felt more comfortable doing interviews. And so I was able to like release myself from the fear or awkwardness of what I perceived an interview would look like.
Interesting. So kind of being in your own space and they're being in their own space, and a little bit of almost like the separation, but still being there provides some comfort.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so what was the topic that you ultimately arrived at, and how did you arrive at that topic?
So I'm very interested in historical clothing and historical dress throughout time. And so I wanted to do my project on kind of the cross-section of clothing and identity and how people, express themselves through their clothing. And so I interviewed a variety of people that all kind of have a relationship to clothing in an outward way. And I also interviewed somebody who said that they didn't have a relationship to their clothing and their identity, but we ended up speaking a lot about why that was. And I think like I ended up producing a very interesting like set of interviews based on how people perceived, resistance to the norm, because that was the theme of the class, through their clothing and their expression of identity. Fantastic.
And Xander, what about for you? What was your topic? How did you arrive at your topic?
Yeah, so I initially wanted to do I initially wanted to interview Kurdish folks, actually. My time in Iraq, we did go through Kurdish territory, and their specific story of struggle and resistance really stood out to me. Unfortunately, I just wasn't able to easily line up interviewees. I was able to speak with, one interpreter through a friend that had served and everything, but I just couldn't get the resources I needed. So I pivoted to speaking with veterans on mental health, which is also a issue I obviously am very close to. I've personally lost a lot of friends to suicide, both who were in service and following. And so I wanted to do something with people I knew I could interview fairly easily. I had a huge pool of people. I approached social media to get them. I've got veterans pages, as well as just, literally hundreds of veterans on my Facebook. So it made it pretty easy to find people. And I just wanted to take a really in-depth look at the veteran mental health issue and do it through their lens and through their understanding of their experience, what it's like for them to retell their experience also. For those that are telling me things they've never told anybody, and for those that have had to repeat their story ad nauseum just to get the help they're trying to get, and looking at it in a hopefully a more nuanced way than it often does by people that have a little less direct understanding.
Right. And it sounded like you had initially thought about one topic and audience, and then pivoted to another, and social media was an easy way for you to get narrators. Malkah, for you, what was your experience like reaching out and finding narrators? What kind of mechanisms did you use to find interviewees? And
so I really relied on the pool of people that I knew. So I'm a religious Jew that lives in Crown Heights in Brooklyn. And so I interviewed somebody who's since left the community. And I had a co-teacher from a couple of years ago who is now a model. And so I spoke with her, and Professor Napoli was able to connect me with somebody who's a Muslim woman. And so I spoke to her. And then I spoke with one of my current co-teachers who is a non-binary person. And the last person that I spoke to was my partner in the course. So I tried to work within my circle, but I did try and widen it, but I didn't get very many leads. So I worked with what I had.
Sure. Talk a little bit about what the process was like of conducting interviews, technologies that you used, and kind of the process of going from collection to the the final project, which was producing a podcast episode?
So I obviously reached out to people in messaging and social media and such. And then I used TheirStory for the actual interviews themselves. And it was very user friendly, and that I could just launch a session, send the link to the person. And because I generally knew the person, I just sent them the link. I didn't have to send them an invitation or anything. And from there, after I had gone through and done the interview, I had TheirStory automatically transcribe my interviews. And then when I went to create my final podcast project, I used the timestamps in the transcripts in order to find clips. And then I used Garage Band to cut up my interviews and put my narration in, and then I put the whole project together.
Fantastic. And during that process, what were the challenging aspects through that process?
Really, I would say that the most time consuming at the end of the day is going through the interview and really reading through the transcript and listening to sections of the audio in order to figure out what your narrative should be within the course of your ultimate project. So I came into a lot of my interviews with a series of questions in my head, but really ultimately I wanted it to be a kind of conversation between me and my interviewee. And so that obviously led to some difficulty because I wasn't always getting a strict question and then answer. It was kind of question and follow up. So when I went in to edit, that was a little bit more difficult to navigate. But ultimately, I think that I had kind of pinpointed moments in my interviews that I wanted to use for my ultimate project. And so that helped me. I know that Xander's technique was very different than mine. Mine is a little bit more free-handed in that way. But I think ultimately, because I was able to utilize all those different pieces, I was able to get over those initial difficulties.
Fantastic. So it was a combination of tools, everything from TheirStory for collection to transcription, to using Garage Band after that for really the composition of the final piece. And Xander, what about for you? What was your process? And if you would, I know too that there was something interesting that happened after your first interview. So if you want to touch on that, but talk a little bit about your process.
Absolutely. So for me, I knew sort of what I wanted to do early. I knew it had to do with veterans' mental health, but I didn't know what was going to make it unique. And so realistically, my first interview, I didn't have my questions in order. I really was more or less unprepared. And that being said, I still had a 2.5-hour, pretty solid interview with a veteran friend whom I served with. And initially, we did it over Facebook, actually. We did the interview over Facebook. It was the easiest thing for him to use. He was on his phone. I hadn't really fully messed with TheirStory yet enough to know how quick and easy it was. And so I recorded off of subsequent software. I have open broadcast software, if any of you are familiar. So I used open broadcast software to record the interview over Facebook. And we had a good interview. Nonetheless, it still provided, a little bit of complication in that I had, I was using one thing to record, one thing to do the actual interview and everything. But nonetheless, fortunately, after speaking with Zach for about 5 minutes, I realized I could just upload my file to TheirStory, and that made it easy. So I had all the transcription done on TheirStory still, even though I didn't record it on there. I uploaded it, and it was really quick and easy. And then that subsequently made it easier for when I would go back later, and I did end up recording all of my following interviews on TheirStory. Everything was just in one place, which was just phenomenal to have. But nonetheless, I went through trying to figure out what could make my opinion and understanding of veterans' mental health unique and a little more nuanced. And I fortunately was also gifted with some really strong testimony from my interviewees. And, dealing with everything from suicide to what it's like watching people go through trauma, severe trauma, to even just being open and honest about what it's like dealing with your family when you're gone 9, 12, 15 months out of the year. and being raw and honest about that. And so I personally had hours of clips. I could have, I fortunately reached Professor Napoli's mark and probably could have gone well over it if I had done 2 more interviews of 7 hours. But, you know, I wanted to do them, you know, justice going through that. And so I cut it down to 20 minutes and had a really solid group of people speaking on what their experience was like, what their perception of veteran mental health was, and what was being done about it, whether adequately and inadequately, and just, you know, where they thought things were going. And again, I was able to do that really easily, considering I'm currently super far geographically, and, you know, they have busy schedules, they all work full-time jobs, or, you know, despite being disabled veterans. And again, all of that was made easier through the medium in which we did this, and through Zach's program. Just made it, it made the project very, very easy. And I had 3 weeks of computer issues as well, just for the record. I literally didn't have a functional computer for 3 weeks. So I was able to scrounge rapidly and do things in a time frame that, according to Professor Napoli, from the good old days of oral history, if you will, would have cost me a lot more money and taken a lot more time. So nonetheless, I had a pretty solid experience, and my project came out very nicely, and they were all pleased with how I took their testimony, which made me the most happy.
Fantastic. And so I'm curious, you mentioned that you were able to do this a lot more quickly, and I think you had mentioned to me before that there was an aspect of the transcript that had a factor in that. Can you talk a little bit about that, or what were the factors that you thought allowed you to kind of accelerate how quickly you could put together a project like this?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, for context, I put most of this together right at the deadline. I had my clips chosen. Thanks to the transcription, I knew what I wanted to use. I was able to go back and sit and listen and read the transcription and say, okay, here's what he said, here's the inflection behind it, here's how that really weighs in heavily into what I'm describing. And again, even though I recorded the first one through Facebook and OBS, open broadcast software, being able to transport that, I had that first interview, the full transcription, and, you know, some of it needed a little, I had to, you know, double check a couple of things. It wasn't perfect. But nonetheless, it made it really easy, so that despite me being almost analog for 3 weeks, I was still able to cohesively put things together, so that when I finally got my computer fixed with maybe 10 days to go before the deadline, I was able to, again, you know, take everything, move it really quickly from TheirStory to Audacity, which is where I built my project. You know, just immediately click drag. Professor Napoli also was able to help me. I couldn't pull stuff into our Dropbox, for example, because, again, computer wasn't working. Professor Napoli, you know, hey, just get it uploaded somehow. I got my computer working for 5 minutes, got it uploaded, and Professor Napoli was able to pull it into Dropbox for me, because our class had all of their stories in its own unit. So he was able to just click, see it as soon as it was up, and take it down. And again, it saved me. I mean, legitimately, given my computer issues and the deadlines for the class, which Professor Napoli was more than generous with, thank you again, it still just was very difficult, you know, to get that done otherwise. I wouldn't have been able to get it done flat out. It wouldn't have happened. I would have been begging Professor Napoli to still give me a good grade while finishing the incomplete 2 weeks later.
Great. And maybe Malkah and then Xander too, thoughts around ethical considerations for your projects. And then after we talk about this, I'm going to ask Professor Napoli a little bit about another mechanism of short form oral histories that we did during the class as well. That was not TheirStory, but rather was PixStori. But let's focus on ethical considerations for a moment. Malkah, how did that factor into your process and specifically the interviews that you did?
So we had to have everyone sign a consent form. And so I also had at least one or two people request that they not be on video. So when I did the video, I just from TheirStory would download the audio file, and then I was able to clip it together as a whole audio track rather than with video. And at least one person said that if I were to like put this anywhere to publish it, they would have wanted me to like change their voice around. And so I think like, obviously there was that conducive aspect to it, but I think like we covered our bases in that way.
Great. And Xander, anything for you around ethics? And I see a question from Siobhan. We'll come to that next. Xander?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I was dealing with veterans and some fairly heavy testimony, and you know, I wanted to make sure that, again, they felt safe and everything. So we did, you know, have our documentation for them to sign appropriately, and that was pretty easy. I just used Adobe and was able to send all of that through. Everything got signed quickly. You know, one person faxed something to me just because that's what they had. Fortunately, I have a fax. And yeah, the primary concern of them feeling, you know, that their testimony was protected and everything, I feel was squared away, you know, relatively easily through a couple of forms. You know, we still had to do that separately, but that was something that was done pretty quickly, and we had a strong understanding of, thanks to Professor Napoli, the importance.
Great, thank you. And I see a question here from Siobhan Warrington. She says, I'd really be interested to hear more about teaching / learning about oral history remotely. What aspects of the design of Professor Napoli's course / approach were the highlights? And Professor Napoli, any tips for someone who is about to design a remote program for potential oral history interviews overseas? Many thanks. Professor Napoli, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
I'm glad to. Let me jump off first off what Xander had to say about the forms, and this came in the form of a question too from Tammy. We at Brooklyn College developed a number of years ago something called the Listening Project, and the Listening Project is a collaborative oral history program project, you might say, that takes in English and music and sociology and more. As we designed this back in 2015, we approached the IRB. And we got an exemption from having to go through IRB each and every time. So we produced an informed consent form and deeds of gift, which we ran through the college lawyer, and they, you know, they gave us their approval. Those are the basic forms we use. We update them each year so that they are, you know, the dates stay appropriate. I've dropped a link to the basic forms into the chat. The deal here is that students had to send out those forms to the interviewees in advance, then address that question of consent before the interview began. I gave them some text they needed to read about asking questions concerning whether or not they individuals understood what they were getting involved in. And then the forms needed to come back signed. Whether or not the individual agreed to make the interview public, I had to have an informed consent in order to accept the recording as a part of their coursework. Right? I hope that makes that clear. Concerning the highlights to the class, you do have the syllabus. I think I'm going to allow the students to talk about the things that were most successful. The tip that maybe I would offer is, well, first off, you got to have awesome students, right? I mean, you guys by now have been as impressed with my students as I am every day. I'm privileged to sit in the classroom with them. So if you want to have a great class, get great students, as I did do. I suppose it's, for me, a matter of preparation. Online learning requires more. In my opinion, advanced preparation. The dance of instruction is very different online than it is in person, it feels. So I had to have my audio clips in line and in place, and if I was going to play video, all of that had to be set up well in advance. I hope that comes close to answering the question, and if it didn't, please follow up.
And a question from Bridget here about the course was the intention to teach the process of collecting oral histories and/or to produce publishable historical research?
It's theory and method in the sense that I want to teach them about the process, and I want to teach them about using the recordings to do something. So they had to record, They had to do some writing about their interviews. They had to write a 7 to 10 page paper, taking one interview and looking closely at what I called historical context for the testimony, and essentially placing that autobiography into historical context. And then they had to do something with the recordings, bring them together in such a fashion that they produced their understanding of what the recordings taught them about the issue they elected to investigate. And the range of topics taken up by my students was just extraordinary. It ranged from clothing to veteran mental health, but also the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, to students dealing with being stuck home in the time of COVID while dealing with sexual identity issues. I mean, it was amazing to allow students the freedom to do what they wanted to do, the things that spoke deeply to who they were. The podcast posted, they are classroom products, and they are not essentially intended for public release, right? Unless everybody who participated in the project agreed, they're not publicly available. Xander, is everybody on your podcast agreed to make this, gift the interviews to the public domain?
Yes, I do believe so.
Then we can share that one. And Malkah, what about you? I think we had some reservations on your project, right? That's right.
Yeah,
so Malkah,
we did.
that's right. That's understandable. But there's one or two that got agreement to place the interviews in the public domain, and I'm glad to try to share those after we're done here today.
Yeah. And so along the lines of kind of what Professor Napoli was talking about in terms of the intent of kind of like what the experience would mean for the students, maybe Malkah and Xander, if you want to speak to, I mean, what did it mean to you? What do you feel like you took away throughout the process and learned? Malkah, maybe do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think that I kind of had a vague idea of how I perceive like my own personal identity expressed in my clothing. And I've always had like an eclectic sense of fashion anyway. And through quarantine, I had like begun to just produce my own clothing, and like I taught myself how to sew and that kind of thing. And so I kind of wanted to explore the idea of how other people feel about the clothing that they wear and how they present themselves through their clothing to the rest of the world. And I really got a variety of answers and of people just describing how clothing played out in an overt way or in a subtle way to their own formation of identity, or to the way that their clothing ultimately aligned with their identity. So for example, one of my interviewees spoke about how when they were young, their mother treated them as though they were a boy, and then they hit puberty and they realized that like biologically they were not a boy. And so it was a whole process for them to understand that they had been dressing as a boy and being a boy for a very long period of time, and then exploring that identity of what it looked like to present as a girl, and then ultimately to come to their own like solidification of their identity as a non-binary person when they were an adult. So that like expression of identity in their clothing looks so different from mine or from my friend who left the religious Jewish community and dresses however she wants now. So I think like I explored an avenue of my own thought while seeing how other people think, and that's how I formulated my narrative.
Fantastic. And maybe Xander, talk a little bit about what you feel like you took away, you learned, and then let's maybe play some short clips. And if we have time, we'd love to show also kind of a PixStori factored in, because I thought that was a really unique application and use and moment in the class. Xander, go ahead, maybe what you learned, and then let's segue into clips.
Yeah, I mean, I learned a wealth of stuff, but more specifically dealing with the interviewing side, dealing with veteran interviews itself can be difficult. They're not the most forthcoming necessarily people. Simultaneously, I found it very easy. I knew these veterans personally, most of them, and I am a veteran, so they approach me a bit differently. And also, I think that actually interviewing people remotely in this context specifically, I'm not saying all, but in this one, it made them feel really comfortable. You know, them being able to be in their house, you know, away from whatever. In one of my interviewees' case, he was sitting outside. I was interviewing him through his phone, and he was watching his kids play in the yard. So it was a little bad for the audio, but in terms of allowing him to feel comfortable to get through stuff, and when he would get too emotional, be able to be like, hold on, I got to go take care of my kid, and then come back and reset. You know, that's an opportunity that was afforded through this entire process. You know, despite it being a result of something so negative, I do feel that it was a positive that came out of interviewing this way. And, you know, really taking this opportunity as a way to learn how to listen effectively. I'm a big talker, but I'm someone that likes to hear about your life story. And so I had a natural inclination toward oral history, and using this process and project as a means to really just stop and listen exclusively and let people tell their entire story in a more unadulterated way, trying to lead them as little as possible. I tried to emulate Amy Starcheski, who is someone that we listened to that I really appreciated her work. And so you know, changing how I interact with human beings on a fundamental level, but also applying that in an academic sense, and learning to get the information I need while doing as little as possible. You know, giving them a prompt and then letting them speak, you know, completely unfettered, and getting so much out of it. I mean, every single one of my interviews was over 90 minutes. I didn't have anybody that was sitting there, you know, even my brother-in-law, who I interviewed, who is a Marine, number one, and number two, he was born in Ukraine, and he's very, you know, has a thick Russian accent and is a very stoic individual. Even him, you know, he was willing to just consistently give me quality information. And I learned things about him and his understanding of mental health, that even though we've seen each other at dinners and spoken and events, I had never had. And so again, I actually think that was stimulated through doing this via TheirStory, you know, and doing it remotely specifically. And so, yeah, I learned a ton out of the class, and really specifically, I learned some skills that I hope I can take abstract of oral history and further myself with. Fantastic.
I love that. The process itself, just kind of informing how you speak with others and listen. Fantastic. Malkah, do you want to show kind of the unique use of PixStori and what that looked like? I see there were some folks, Ellen Brooks, who had said she would love to see it, and I think that that's a good thing to highlight. And it was also unique. We've talked a lot about kind of the longer form content. Maybe you want to talk about that and show a clip.
So for one of our classes, we had an assignment to use PixStori, which I'll show in a moment. And we had to take a photo that we had taken during self-isolation. So many people chose to take pictures of a variety of different things. And for our final for the class, we had to order the pictures and voice narratives that were used to describe the photo into how we would present a narrative of life during the coronavirus. And so each person chose a very different thing to speak about and chose a different picture. So I will show mine. As I spoke about, I'm very interested in clothing. And so this was my photo, and rather than describing it, I'll play my clip. I'll just make sure.
In this image, this is an image of the first entire hand sewing project that I did during quarantine. Over the course of quarantine, I taught myself how to sew, first with a machine and then really with hand sewing. And I wanted to construct a romantic era gown and over jacket robe. And so I hand sewed everything from the undergarments to the dress to the robe. And it's a mixture of cotton and silk and linen. And then I purchased a romantic era reproduction fan. And I did a little mini photo shoot outside my house with my brother. And I think it kind of speaks to the fact that although I chose to be very creative and busy with my time, because that's kind of how I dealt with the whole, world being so crazy in that moment. And I feel like I really taught myself how to do something that I will use and enjoy for the rest of my life.
So when we all had the class that we had after this assignment was we each went through and each person showed their picture and played their clip, and we discussed about it, discussed each one. And at the end, it took up the entire class time. And I think we all came to a place where we understood each other better, and it really contributed to the community and culture of our class. And we also could all recognize that we had to do this later in the semester rather than earlier, because we were able to sit in a place of more vulnerability since we had already known each other for 2 months or 2.5 months at that point. And so each person commented, different people commented, and Xander had also had a picture and a piece. And not only did it create connection between each of the people in the class, but it also it felt very cathartic to kind of sit in the space of hearing everyone talk about what they had gone through over the past year. And it caused it, at least for me, it made me feel very empathetic towards others' experiences during the pandemic.
Xander, would you please also jump in right there and talk about your reaction to that moment in the class? We had some correspondence immediately after the class finished.
Yeah, that class session admittedly felt more like a group therapy session than anything else. It was one of the best experiences I've had in a classroom. Actually, I would say it was the best experience I've had in a classroom to date. And really made me feel, almost like something you'd get out of a classroom experience when you're younger, up through middle school even. It was a really close bond that we all shared through this, this classroom exercise where we are, choosing a picture that meant something to us in the time of COVID, and how we interpreted it and our feelings around it. And everyone really put time into it, despite it being such a little 15-20 minute project that you can do very simply, just sorting through your photos and saying, hey, here's this, and then giving 5 minutes of dialogue on it. But I feel like everybody really put a lot into that because it was unique. It was something none of us had ever done before. It was something none of us had ever even heard of before with PixStori. But again, this kind of speaks volumes to the class, and not to talk him up too much, but Professor Napoli's great instruction, because this was a constant in the class, doing something new, doing something unique, learning to do it together, and then we all produce a product together. That's all our own, but we all go through and take the time to listen to it. We don't just hand it in to Professor Napoli and say, okay, cool, that's done, checked off. Professor Napoli took the time to sit with us and go through each of our 2 to 5 minute PixStories and create a classroom conversation that lasted the entirety of the day. But in doing so, brought us all, very close. We had such a great classroom environment between both Hunter and Brooklyn College. It's not close. It was the best classroom environment I've had yet.
Something did happen there, and it was Professor Frisch's their PixStori that provoked it. It was also the class dynamic itself. It was also a bunch of smart students. I will tell you that one thing we had done, which I think actually worked, and it is a bit of a if I were to offer a suggestion in online learning, is we created support groups early in the semester, which were required. You had to work with you were not doing therapy with one another, but helping one another, right? So Xander is a streamer. He knows hard-end software very well, and he was exceptionally well placed to help students who didn't know the technology as well as others might. So, he jumped into his support group, which I assigned, and provided assistance to one woman who really didn't have those skills. In other groups, the support worked in different ways. Malkah's support group person was absolutely coincidentally a person that she felt surprisingly close to. It happened so that there were bonds already created, partly by the structure of the class, but then this tool, which is quasi-confessional in some ways, but also, to repeat, extremely productive. It really worked. It is, as Professor Fish will tell us, a kind of different model of doing oral history, and one that was very useful this semester.
So I'd love, we are at the hour, but I'd love maybe to close, Xander, with a clip, an example of your final project, and then just any final comments, and we will wrap up.
Absolutely. So I just want to preface this a little. I'm going to play like about 1 minute from my 20-minute project. And this is veterans speaking about stuff that they see. This is a little more, I would say, normal in comparison to the other things that I discuss in my project. But I think it's important to hear the stuff that weighs on veterans so heavily, and to fully appreciate their struggle in not being able to adequately find help. And so here we go. Let me play that. Okay. It is difficult for civilians to comprehend what veterans go through and what they see, not just in combat environments, but in non-combat environments as well.
Then Staff Sergeant Self and those 4 guys died. The only person that lived, DeRuzio, the driver, was 18 years old, and he went back. So I was actually in the same WTU as him, and he fought to not get kicked out and made it back in time to redeploy and got a second Purple Heart. He got blown up again. The kid, man, he didn't die, thank God, but Mike DeRuzio, I'll never forget that kid.
Well, we would always have predator feeds. We'd always have them online and everything like that. And daily, we'd see successful strikes and people and that kind of stuff. And it's almost impossible not to draw conclusions.
Though most service members. So yeah, that was just a little bit of 2 of my good friends, Ryan Harbaugh and Stephen Brown, and them giving their oral histories to me. Stephen actually volunteered that fairly early into our conversation, and interviewing him was probably the easiest thing I've ever done in my life because he was just prepared to speak. Ryan, we took a little more time with, but again, they were very happy to speak with me, fortunately, on, what they saw, what they faced, and what they think needed to be done going forward with the VA and the culture of mental health in the military and beyond, on top of that, with the police force and other similar jobs. And yeah, it was a great experience. I was able to put everything together very easily through the mediums that we used, TheirStory being a huge help to that. Professor Napoli's direction in terms of first teaching us the process, showing us, how great interviewers did their work, whether they were podcasters or whether, they're Portelli or, other oral historians. And I feel that it allowed me to do a good job, both by people that I consider, my friends, but also a community that is extremely discussed, but very poorly understood generally, I think, despite this. And yeah, I was very, very proud of the work that I got to accomplish as a result. And they, like I said, they gave me the seal of approval, which meant more than anything. So.
Fantastic. Thank you, Xander. And any closing things to add, Malkah or Professor Napoli, before we call it a wrap for today?
I would just add that I felt like it was very valuable that we had everything so prepared, that everything was so prepared for us to come into the class and like feel comfortable in doing what we were supposed to do. And we were also very supported as interviewers. And so, for example, even the PixStori situation, it was like we were interviewing ourselves. And so we did experience, and we had to conduct interviews with our support partners. So we felt the experience of being the interviewer and the interviewee. And that allows you to create sympathy with your interviewee, which in turn can construct or create the environment for your own interview that you do. And I think like at the end of the day, all of those factors coming together, just the very preparedness of Professor Napoli and the technology that we used really created a very solid foundation for all of us to be successful.
Fantastic. Professor Napoli?
Well, I got to
last
make my
words?
nod. Yeah, I got to make my nod in the direction of Zach, because without Zach, this wouldn't have worked half as well. His presence in my classroom was a pleasure. It was a privilege, and it made me feel supported. And I was grateful for that. A very useful tool I will continue to use in my classes in spring, and undoubtedly going forward.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Napoli, to Xander, to Malkah, for taking the time to host this discussion with me, and it was an absolute pleasure to be a part of the class. And thank you for inviting me in, and it was great just being a part. So, with that, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, feel free to follow up directly with any of us. My email is zach@TheirStory.io. I'll throw it into the chat, and we'll share the chat and make that accessible as well. If anyone else wants to put in their email, feel free. And again, been a pleasure. Thank you.